this toast while we talk about sewing terms. You don't have to be intimidated by sewing if you don't know the sewing terms. These are just simple terms that we use in our patterns at Rooney, and you'll also see them in different tutorials we put out. And knowing these terms are just going to make sewing a lot easier for you. And I never want to use terms that are hard to understand or only a certain group of people use them. I want to make sure that sewing is attainable for everyone. So I wanted to break down the main sewing terms that you need to know when you're starting out sewing. So grab some toast and some tea and let's get started. Is that really lame? Something you'll come across a lot is the term right sides together. Knowing the right side from the wrong side of fabric is not always super straightforward, but it is important while you're sewing so that you make sure when you turn your garment right side out that the right side will be out. Sometimes it's obvious what the right side and the wrong side is. You can see that the pattern or the color is more vibrant on the right side and it is a printed on fabric, and the back is lighter and you can just tell that it is the wrong side. But sometimes it's a little less straightforward and you can just take a deeper look at the fabric and see the wovenness of the fabric and which side you want to choose for the right side. I find that linen fabrics are a little harder and it can kind of seem like it's interchangeable what the right side and the wrong side is, especially if it is just a color and not a print. Sometimes you can look on the side, which is the Selvage Edge that we'll talk about a little bit later, and you can see this manufactured side, and oftentimes if it's a printed fabric, there's a little icon that will show you what the right side is as opposed to the wrong side. So usually you sew the right sides together so that the seam is on the wrong side and the inside of your garment. It can be a little bit confusing, but if you need to, you could also use a water-soluble pin and kind of make a mark on the right side so that you know which side to use. When we're talking about basics, the side seam is very foundational and something you'll need to know. It is the side seam, and the seam is what joins two fabric pieces together. So the side seam is on the side of how the garment would fit on a body. You can also see the seam at the shoulders or the waist or the back or the center front. There's a lot of seams throughout sewing a garment together, but the seam is when a stitch joins two pieces of fabric together. A term we love to use here is the gather stitch. So gathering is either you love it or you hate it, but my goal is that you would love it. It creates a beautiful look to the finished piece. So a gather stitch is when you take a wide piece of fabric and you change your stitch length to a longer stitch, and then you take the bobbin thread of that stitch and you hold it while you gather up the rest of the fabric. It joins the fabric together to fit in another piece that is a smaller width, and that's where you see different tiers or just a different drape on a dress. You can also see it on sleeves where it's a wider sleeve, but it's gathered so that it can fit the arm a little bit better in one area. A gather stitch can also be very subtle, like the back of our billy jacket. There's a subtle gather stitch on the back to create just a different flow It is such a versatile stitch and something that you'll use in a lot of patterns and tutorials. So the Selvage Edge is on the side of all fabrics that you'll find from the fabric store. If you pick up fabric from a thrift store or secondhand, or maybe the fabric has been used in the past and the Selvage Edge is no longer there. So the Selvage Edge is a manufactured edge and you'll be able to see it on all fabric. You're able to see how it's finished on one side, and this is so that your fabric flows and forms to the body correctly. This is really important because if you cut something that's not according to the Selvage Edge and parallel to it, then the fabric might not stretch and wear properly on the body. On your pattern piece, you'll find the grain line, and where the grain line is, you want it to be parallel to the Selvage Edge. Next, you want to know what a top stitch is. A top stitch can be decorative, or it can just be the stitch that is sewn from the right side down, or a stitch that is sewn from the right side. You can do top stitch detailing on pockets and on the side seams to kind of pull out a certain characteristic. An understitch is when you have a facing and there's this seam allowance that you want to lie better. So if you're doing an understitch on a facing, you would iron the seam down towards the facing and you would stitch all along the facing. This would only be shown from the inside of the garment, and you can see how the facing lies so much better because you did that extra step to understitch the remaining seam allowance to the facing. The bias is cutting fabric on a 45-degree angle of the fabric to allow it to curve nicely to the body or a shape on different fabric, like a neckline or an armhole. The seam allowance is the excess fabric between the stitch and the side of the fabric. A seam allowance could be anywhere from 1/8 of an inch to an inch, and usually the excess fabric is trimmed off or overlocked or pressed to one side. So when you're sewing, your pattern will usually say 1/2 inch seam allowance, and that means you're going to line up your needle 1/2 inch or an inch, whatever it calls for, away from the side of the fabric. A notch is indicated by a triangle on your pattern, and this is where you're going to take your scissors and cut a little 1/8 of an inch notch into your fabric. This can indicate where your pattern pieces are going to line up together when you're sewing and make sure things are aligning properly. It could also indicate where you want a curve to naturally flow. So your pattern will call for this, but a notch is just cutting into the fabric just a little bit, and you make sure you don't go past the seam. A zigzag stitch is pretty standard on all sewing machines, and I recommend, if you're choosing a sewing machine, to choose one that also has a zigzag stitch. I'm pretty sure all sewing machines have it, but if you need some sewing machine recommendations, you can click the video that I'm linking here, and it will help point you in the right direction. But a zigzag stitch is a zigzag, and this can help fabric prevented from fraying. It can help you sew stretch fabric. It is a must-have on your machine. And the weight of fabric is another thing that I like to point out when I'm choosing fabric. Different fabrics have different weights. They feel different. They drape differently. They are heavy and some are light. So the weight of it can range from different ounces. And if it's lighter an ounce, it's a more breezy and flowy fabric. And if it's a heavier ounce, like 8 to 10, it might not be suitable for the garment that you're sewing if you're sewing clothing. So I recommend staying around 5 to 6 or below when you're looking for a different weight. This is especially helpful when you're shopping for fabric online where you can't feel the fabric, because if it's too weighty, it will just weigh you down, it will weigh the garment down. It might not flow to the pattern that you're sewing. So definitely check this in the description of all the fabric that you're shopping for. If you need a fabric shopping guide, I have a video linked here. There are, of course, so many different terms with sewing, and I'm just scratching the surface, but if you know all of these terms that I talked about today, you're gonna be good. You're gonna be ready to sew your first project. So if you have any questions, let me know below. If you need some more beginner tutorials and help, then click this next video.